Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this RTS event. Thank you for joining us. My name is Jake Cantor. I'm a journalist for Deadline. I'm the former media correspondent at The Times. We are gathered this evening to discuss an issue that could define the UK's media landscape for the next decade and more, and that is how to fund the BBC. Auntie's just around the corner, so I'm sure there'll be some burning ears at New Broadcasting House. Look, as all of you will know, most of us pay a £174.50 licence fee to finance the BBC's operations. Beyond the current charter, it's anyone's guess how the BBC will be paid for. The licence fee model is under unprecedented pressure. It's seen by many as being regressive in the age of YouTube and Netflix. And the government is exploring other options to fund the BBC as part of charter renewal talks. For the first time as well, the BBC itself has said it is open-minded about ditching the licence fee. So if not the licence fee, then what? And if change is coming, how will it play out over the coming months? Big questions. Luckily, we have a power panel equipped to answer them. I'm delighted to say that we're joined this evening. I'll go from my left to right. We have Mike Darcey, the former News UK CEO and now a senior media advisor. We've got Lord Tony Hall, the former BBC Director General. Dame Caroline Dinenage, a Tory MP and chair of the influential Culture Select Committee. And Mark Oliver, the esteemed media economist. Before we dive into a chat, Mark is going to set the scene for us. So over to you.
So this is, as you said, a scene setter. I'm not going to share my views on the future licence fee. That's for others to do. This is a whirlwind tour of my 40 years looking at BBC's funding. My first day in my job, I was told of a project to look at the future of BBC funding for the Peacock Committee that Mrs. Thatcher had insisted to be set up to bring advertising onto the BBC. He did about everything in broadcasting except bring advertising onto the BBC. So this subject's been around for a long time. My first point is probably just a bit of a nudge to the people who organise this. I think to discuss funding in isolation of everything else you need to discuss about the BBC is always a bit artificial. Its purposes, the objectives and impact it's supposed to have, the costs and spending priorities that leads to, and the accountability and how that fits into funding is all part of a joined-up argument. That's why it's quite complex too. So we start with funding because that's kind of what people get their heads around, but it's part of a complex mixture of issues which will be part of the whole charter discussion over the next 18 months. So I'm going to go through the debate as it's happened in the past, summarising a lot of arguments and positions. And then I'm going to talk about a few trends which might impact people's views. And then one or two bits of thinking about reforms to the licence fee that have been mentioned and how they might work out in practice. So the first thing about the debate is that they tend to go into two camps, which is we're going to publicly fund it, but how do we do that? A licence fee may not be fit for purpose. Are there other ways of funding it publicly, from taxation, a household charge like there is in Germany, everybody pays it, a progressive licence fee, we'll come on to that, general taxation, or even a lottery. The lottery was suggested by the Peacock Committee in 1986, but someone else got that money. And on the other side, there is, well, fund it commercially. And then it's either fund it through subscription, and then you have the problem about it's not universal anymore and it excludes people, and maybe only people can afford it can have it, so it's no longer a public service. Public through advertising, that could be available to everybody, but is there enough to go around, and would it undermine the actual public service? And subscription and advertising together. What tends not to get discussed as much is hybrid funding, some mixture of public or licence fee funding and commercial funding, which actually is what happens at the moment because the BBC earns quite a lot of money from commercial sources. So that's not really discussed. It's kind of always dismissed. And to sort of summarise things that have been said, so taxation is usually rejected because it's subject to short-term political pressures. We've seen what's happened recently on things that are subject to short-term political pressures. And the BBC doesn't want to be part of that. It means political pressure can be applied to the BBC in a way that's very direct and immediate. Lottery opportunity has gone, and also it's regressive. It tends to be poor people who bet more as a portion of income. The commercial funding, well, subscription undermines universality, as we talked, and it won't be enough because there are lots of other pay TV players around nowadays. It's a very crowded market. And advertising, there may not be enough, and it would harm the commercial market and may undermine public purposes in the long run. Hybrid tends to be rejected as just too complicated. It might create a two-tier public service, and it would undermine long-term support for the public funding, because if you start to grow your commercial income, people always try and chip away at the public funding. So in the end, you always migrate to more and more commercial funding, less and less public funding. And so you get towards the commercial solution in the end. Another thing to note is that the people who object to the license fee are not one homogenous group. In fact, it's a coalition of the unwilling, to adopt a phrase that's been used recently. And actually, there are at least 6 different groups, some of which overlap and some which are very different. So you start with the very low income people who just can't afford it, or it's difficult to afford. You then have non-consumers. I don't watch it, don't use it, and they've got a way out. We'll come on to that. There are ones who have value for money, which is I do use it a bit, but less than I think I should be paying for it. And actually Netflix is better value for money. They're kind of very practical people about, can I afford it? Do I use it? How much do I use it? Does it balance what I pay? And then the next 3 are more kind of conceptual. So there are people who just believe in free markets. They can't understand why you need to tax people to add to what the commercial market already provides. It's kind of in principle objection to being taxed to provide a TV and radio product. There are people who are influenced by political bias from both sides. Either they're a group of lefties or they're establishment stooges, and sometimes both. And then the 6th one are fairness focused, which are the people who say it's regressive and I can afford it, but many can't. So all those groups are very different. They overlap a bit, but whenever you think about people who really object to license fee, it's not one homogenous group of people who have a problem with it. Another issue, kind of from general sort of society trends, is there is a kind of trend at the moment to see everything you get from public services. What does it give to me or my family? Or the other extreme, what does it give to my group and my interest group? What can I get from it? What tends to get less airtime in debates is what's good for the UK society as a whole. And you could argue the BBC was established because of that. And so it's slightly subject to those 2 trends, one tougher times and a more solipsistic attitude to life. And the other one is the identity politics or group politics is what dominates my feelings. And so that sets a context of the debate when you're trying to argue for something that's supposed to be good for everybody. And that may be difficult. Some research, there's been a lot of research done in the past and recently about various issues of the BBC, cutting across those 6 groups. One is about the trustworthy and accuracy of its news, how well it does it, and it's still well trusted by the majority of people. But there are quite a few people who think it's too far right, and some people think it's too far left, and some who don't know, quite a few who don't know. There's also preferred funding. Generally, license fee is seen as the least of all evils. There is a real majority for subscription or advertising. And value for money, well, it depends what survey you look at. One taking the time of the last charter said that, the majority of people either thought it was good value or neutral. One taken more recently suggests that that number of good value has shrunk. They're not consistent surveys, so I wouldn't say it's a trend, but there is evidence around. Another way of assessing value for money, which isn't just about asking a question, is what's called deprivation study. And the last one of these was done in 2021. This is where you take the BBC in its entirety away from people, a sample of people who say you can't use it, and we would technologically switch them off or just say you can't and monitor them. And then after 9 days, you then offer them the money to buy back the BBC or to pocket it. And actually, once they've had it taken away, their need to have the BBC goes up. So of those who said they would prefer to stop paying, 2/3 said they'd pay in full now, and 13% said they'd pay something. And of those who said they'd like pay less, 73% said they'd pay a lot. So once it's taken away, it's the thing, once you destroy it, you don't know what you've lost. So, however, one problem about that is that when people lose the BBC, everything else stays the same. And you might argue if the BBC disappeared a lot, then the commercial market might actually provide more. So it has that disadvantage. So trends, that's the debate. So trends. Well, the first trend to notice is that the average number of people who've got TV licenses is nowhere near the number of households, and it's diverging. And one should note that the number of people who said to have TV licenses actually includes the over 75s on pension credits, because they've got a license even though it's a free license. But there are people who evade the license, there's people who have no TV, and there's people who have got through the IP access only no player use rule, which means if you don't really have access to a TV signal, just IP, and you don't use iPlayer, you can claim that you shouldn't pay the license fee, and that's a growing number, and that's one of the main reasons for that divergence. So it's no longer a universal charge, really. In terms of the inflation license fee, why do people have a problem with the level of license fee? Well, actually, over 20 odd years, it's actually grown by much less than RPI or consumer price inflation. So actually, it hasn't inflated by many other things. So in some senses, it's quite odd that people should be so concerned about it, and it's probably more to do with the enforced nature and the flat fee nature, everybody pays it. The second thing to note is that in the historic context, the TV license fee hasn't gone up by as much as a lot of other things that you can't really avoid. Now, this you might say should be benefit of the license fee. It's great value for money, but actually works the other way. People have to pay so much for these things, they don't want the license fee to go up. A lot of pressure about affordability. The other thing that comes into play is that the BBC may be flat, but it's everybody's in the same boat. When you say everybody, the other public service broadcasters, everybody's been flat. So the BBC is already richer than the other ones, so it shouldn't really get much richer because it's got so many resources. And so sometimes the commercial rivals basically say that BBC shouldn't have more money because we're finding it hard to grow. This number, by the way, the lighter line at the top is the full contribution of commercial activities to the BBC. That's profits from commercial, it's reinvestment from commercial, and it's contribution to overheads. And to make a like-for-like comparison, on the ITV number, that lighter bit is actually the profits from ITV studios. So it's a similar. The other thing the trend that may be causing value for money problems is obviously generational consumption, and this actually is a measure of consumption that includes YouTube and video share sites. And it's quite clear, everybody knows this, but people under 35 or under 45 are really moving away from linear TV and also moving away just from TV as we know it and towards social media and YouTube. And that's obviously consumption in the end will affect people's view of the value. But it's not actually just generational. Each generation is moving away from linear TV. It used to just be young, but everybody is moving relentlessly away from linear TV. So you can't just say when they grow up, they'll watch TV. They won't. In fact, it's the reverse. During COVID, older people adapted younger people's habits. In terms of the BBC's performance, in terms of share, actually the BBC in TV has done very well. And this is share of the traditional TV audience. It's live and catch up. It's what Barb has measured for many years. And even its share of the 16 to 34-year-old age groups is still at 30%. It's suffered more in radio because commercial radio has expanded its offering. In terms of reach, which in some ways is more important for the BBC, how many people have used it versus how many people pay it, standard measures of reach, again, of traditional TV and radio consumption show quite a radical weekly decline. But if you then go to the reach of all BBC services, online, news online, iPlayer, everything, the reach there has started to decline. The weekly reach has gone down from 91% in 1920 to 85%. And even monthly reach, people using something in the BBC once a month, is 95. So 5% don't indulge in the BBC at all. We don't know what the number was back in 2020. It wasn't published. So is it enough if people are consuming you once a month to justify the license fee, or to they just consume you once a week, and there's a 10% difference? So reforming the license fee, a few ideas about that. Concessions. We already have a concession, which is about over 75, now just pension credit over 75s. It used to be all over 75s. Well, actually, it was all households with an over 75-year-old in them, which is actually a bigger number. So if you actually add on more concessions, so you got back to all over 75 households, and other measures like households that qualify for free school meals, disability benefits, incapacity benefits, there's overlap between them. And most of these are actually individuals rather than households, but an estimate of what that might be, which you might be able to give 5 million households a free license fee if you extended concessions and the affordability issue was addressed. The issue about that is if you wanted to maintain the same level of funding, the license fee for everybody else would have to go by over 25%. It goes up to £230. And that would then cause a knock-on effect from value for money. So that's a problem. The poll tax is always council tax. So I'm showing my age. The council tax is always seen as a way because it's more progressive. We know it's got its problems. There are many homes in Band H of widening areas of value, and the South East has lots in Band H. But if you adopted the same kind of ratios of the Band A to Band H, then the top homes will be paying 350 quid. Now, there's a geographic problem about that. For people in Rutland, I didn't realise people in Rutland pay such high. I won't be moving there anytime soon. So high council tax. That's only a 6% increase, but people in Wandsworth, it's about 17% increase. So are you going to start to make the increase of percent, which means people in some places will pay less than others? That doesn't really make sense. So there are complications of all these things about trying to make the license fee more progressive, but it may be the way to go. So some conclusions, probably say a summary rather than conclusions. The license fee has some sustainability issues, especially as a fixed flat fee related to TV ownership or iPlayer usage. And that's likely to get worse, 95% to monthly versus 85% weekly. Public funding replacements are problematic. More concessions might be the way to go, but of course that means pushing up the price for everybody else with the same amount of funding, and that will cause value for money issues. And ads and subscriptions, a total replacement is unlikely. It's not really attracted the majority of consumers or commercial rivals. But hybrid options haven't really been looked at as fully as they might have been. There's also the basic conundrum the BBC's in, which is if it needs high reach to justify its funding, license fee or household charge, does it give it enough funding to generate the reach that then supports the license fee? And it's very easy to get in a downward spiral, a vicious circle, where if you don't get enough funding to maintain the reach, more people start saying, why am I paying it? You get less funding, more people start saying, why am I not paying it? And that's exactly what's been happening over the last 10 years. So you've got to get out of that rut, basically. Making the BBC a mutual, that what hasn't been mentioned, but I know it's around as I think it may well increase accountability on spending priorities, but I think it only really solves the funding problem if it creates a better sense of value for money. And do people feel better about paying the license fee? And how will they measure that? Will they measure it about what it gives to me? Will they measure it about what it gives to my group, which actually means it can get captured by interest groups? And the BBC used to have loads of councils. It got rid of lots from them. And it was like this. It was like a mutual. These councils, regional councils, and even workers' councils, and trade union councils. It was like that. And it got captured by the interest groups, not the public interest group. Or would the actual people as shareholders start to think of the BBC, what it gives to the UK as a whole? And that's the really essential question. How would mutuality actually affect the BBC spending decisions? That's a whirlwind tour.
So, lots to chew on there. And, you can sort of see the very complicated and difficult landscape that the government and the BBC are navigating here. I just wanted to, I know you don't want to give your view specifically, Mark, but I want to go through the rest of the panel and just quickly establish positions. And hopefully that will set the scene for our debate a little bit. So quick fire round. Do you think the license fee is dead? And if so, what's your preferred alternative? I'll start with you, Mike.
I think the license fee has challenges in the sense that, I think as Mark has highlighted there, we're down to about 83% people paying it now. And it's dropping about 2% a year. So I think, and the BBC never likes me saying this, I think to all intents and purposes, it is a subscription service at the moment. There's a price, there's a pool of content, and you choose whether you want to pay to opt in. And if you don't, you don't. I'm not sure what way that is not a subscription service. I think, personally, that while that has its problems, it has a problem of all subscription services. It has, sort of churn issues and all these sorts of things, but we don't call it that because we're still pretending it's not a subscription service. But my instinct is that we will go round the houses on all these other things, and the political will and courage to make a significant and complex change will evaporate as we get close to the line, and we will end up roughly where we are.
Okay.
There may be a bit of progressiveness in there, but my instinct is that what I think the BBC is angling for is it wants a return to a genuinely universal service. I think it wants people to have those opt-outs removed and for everybody to be compelled to pay the license fee.
Yeah.
So it is a universal service.
So the change might actually be in the interest of the BBC. Is suggesting.
Oh, I think that's exactly what Tim Davie wants.
Yeah.
He's arguing for reform, and I think by that he means, can we please not allow people to opt out anymore? Can we make it universal? Can you make everybody pay it, please? That would be a 20% uplift in income. Job done.
Okay.
Whether the government has the courage to do that, I tend to doubt.
Yeah. Thank you. Tony, what's your perspective?
Here we go again. Wrong way round. I thought Mark had got it absolutely right at the top. You've got to start this debate, and we have enough time, thinking, what do you want the BBC to do? What's its role? What's its purpose? In terms of news, in terms of soft power, in terms of local, in terms of the creative economy, in terms of producing dramas and programs that speak to us as opposed to something that's for an international market. Start with what we want the BBC to do and then work out how you fund it. Because as Mark is suggesting, I happen to think the license fee reformed and what Tim is arguing is right. But you can't have any of that debate until you've worked out what the purpose of the BBC is. Second point, I thought Mark was spot on when he looked at the issues to do with society as a whole. You've got to see the BBC as a business, sure, a media business, but also as a cultural phenomenon. It is, in Andy Haldane's words, it's part of our social infrastructure. So you've got to look at in what way is the BBC part of that social infrastructure? What are we wanting it to do as a cultural institution? And can it do that with the money that we've got? So the danger is we fall into, there's a license fee, can it survive and so on? My answer is the license fee will. I think the select committee, which I was on until January, looked at all these issues to make a Bible for everyone to say, here's how you can fund the BBC. As Mark gave evidence, and really extremely clear and very good evidence. Advertising, not enough. Subscription, you lose universality. So you come back to some form of reformed license fee, more proportional to how you can pay it. And there are difficulties around that, as Mark adduced. And also, I think you need to look at, for what are you paying? Is it a television license fee? Is it a broader license fee? And we went through all that debate last time round. But please, my urging is, don't fall into the trap, which has happened to two Director Generals, Mark Thompson and then myself, of saying, here you go, it's a license fee and that's the quantum. By the way, now what can you do? Wrong way round. And I really hope the debate this time is about purpose and function and what this amazing cultural institution, which we're lucky to have, can do.
Okay, let's pick up on that in a second.
Yeah.
So we've got two of you saying you think the license fee will survive. Caroline.
I feel like I should be sitting there because the couple of the things that Tony said, I literally had written down. It's interesting. The first thing that you spoke about, Mark, the right questions in the wrong order, exactly like you said. So I'm going to answer the question two is, what would I like to happen and what do I think will happen, right? Because politicians never really answer the question that you've given them.
Can we answer the question?
So what I would like to happen is for the BBC to start off by having a really honest conversation about what it is we want the BBC to deliver and how much we expect to pay for it. I mean, that would be the really, really interesting starting point. But what will happen is that we have to have those two questions in tandem. We're asking, what do we want the BBC to do? And we're looking at the funding model at the same time. And that is always going to be a recipe for disaster. Second point, similar to what Tony said, the BBC doesn't do a good enough job about selling why it's important. It doesn't do a good enough job of convincing the license fee payer what it is that it offers, which is different from any of the other streamers, any of the other public service broadcasters, anything else, and what the value of it is, the value of it as a trusted source of information, and in a world that we live in at the moment, which is just so crazy and chaotic. My goodness, the world relies upon trusted sources of information, and the BBC has a global reputation for that. We need to value that, and we need to be sort of making sure that we sell that.
Tim would argue he's making that case all the time.
Yeah, he is, but but they need to find more ways. We need to find more ways of doing that than Tim Davies standing up in a sort of high-profile speech that may be heard by people in this room, but isn't getting through to your consumer, who are the ones who are saying they don't feel they're getting the value for money. But also, because of the way that it's structured, the BBC does have to deliver the things that the commercial sector will never do, such as some of your regional radio broadcasting, which has got a dwindling audience, but for those who have it, they value it sort of more than anything. It's sort of an absolute friend and companion to some of the most sort of lowly and isolated people. So we've got to value it for what it does. The problem is, and what I think will happen, is different, because we start off with every politician that's involved with this and everybody who works for the BBC. Excuse me, everybody. Starts off with, we've got an open mind, we've got a blank piece of paper, we're going to look at everything. And then very, very quickly, they discount everything else. So advertising, subscription, and eventually you get back down to the license fee again. So, and more broadly, you get down to whether more people pay the same amount of money, or whether you have the same number of people paying a bit more. I mean, that's effectively what it will come down to.
Okay, and so what's your answer? Will the license fee survive, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that's effectively what I'm saying. I know what I would like to happen, but I think that what will happen is that we sort of revert to the status quo, and that either translates into a wider section of people are paying the same amount of money or similar, or the same amount of people as now are paying more.
So, I mean, you mentioned that these conversations happening simultaneously cannot be is not necessarily a healthy thing. I mean, you have the power to compel ministers in front of your committee. You have power to compel the BBC in front of your committee. Is there enough transparency going into this process as it stands? I mean, we know some of these discussions are going on behind closed doors at the moment about how to fund the BBC going forward. Should they not be happening in public right now?
So to a certain extent that they are happening in public, but then what people say in public and what happens behind closed doors always seem to be two entirely different things. So if you think about sort of mutualisation, for example, as one of the topics, both Dr. Shah has said he's quite sympathetic to the idea of mutualisation. The Secretary of State, Lisa Nandia, says she's quite sympathetic to the idea of mutualisation. That's what they say in public. But in public, they also say we're very open-minded as to what the future funding model will be. But I don't know what is in reality that is the conversation that's happening behind the closed doors.
I mean, Tony, you've been in the room. You've been part of this process. Take us into the room. How do these negotiations start out? And, how do you see it playing out over the coming months based on your own experience of being the other side of the table for ministers?
What I really hope happens this time is not what happened to myself or indeed to Mark T previously, which is you end up in a ferocious combat over the quantum of the license fee over a period of days. John Whittingdale was then the Secretary of State and actually was very much on side, but just said, it's the Treasury, I can't do anything about this. The whole thing takes place behind closed doors, and then kaplonk, out comes a rate, and that's it. And we're all supposed to clap our hands and say, thank you very much. That's not a way to, in a grown-up way, to run an organisation or to provide the money for the services that we want. Now, one idea...
Sorry, do you fear it's going the same way this time around?
I don't want it to go this way, which is why I'm prepared to sit here tonight and say, please don't do this. I actually think the Germans, that some of us took some evidence from, plus the VLV actually came up with an idea that there should be another body that independently looks at the purposes of the BBC and what to correct some of the things that Mark had got, where you see, how it's fallen behind CPI, RPI, and other utilities, and actually look and say, well, what would the right quantum of the license fee to be? Government can then say, well, we accept that or not, but there's a proper public debate about it. And I think that's really, really important. I want there to be a proper public debate about soft power. We keep saying, well, service, fantastic, absolutely great. Oh, yeah, but by the way, any more money? No, there is not. So I can tell you this, which is when there was the the Foreign Secretary was Jeremy Hunt. He had me in and said, I want to talk about how we get from, at the moment, about 400 million people. I want to get to 1 billion people a week. I want to use the World Service, BBC World, because that is one of our big soft power things globally. Totally right about that. When Shirley Williams called it, the best soft power since Shakespeare, she was absolutely spot on. Not my words, her words. She was absolutely spot on. We need to have a debate about that because I can't see that going anywhere. And actually, we should be worried as a wonderful. I love this country, but our voice should be heard out there through World Service, through BBC World, through other programs that we do. Where's the debate about that? Where's the debate about the news deserts, which there are? I mean, the committee I was on have done a report on news deserts. The BBC's role, you're right, Caroline, in terms of local is really important. 20 million people are using local stuff from the BBC each week. You've got Radio Cymru, Radio Nagail, all the local radio stations. This is really important. And the reforms that the BBC have been bringing in to say we can take more of this content online, I think push it further and have a debate and say, what about the BBC is the answer to news deserts and actually becomes the kind of, old terms PA, the system of providing news from localities for almost anyone to use to have community news apps or whatever they sites or whatever they want to do. Again, where's the debate about that? And we should be talking about this because, our regions and our communities need identity. And I go back to Andy Haldane's report about social infrastructure. That's where you see it. If you go around local radio stations, you are part of the social infrastructure. You go to Radio Cumbria, people say Radio Cumbria helps to define us. We need to be having debates about this, and that needs to be grabbing the public attention. But instead we get back to, so what kind of reform with the license? It's important. You've got to do that.
Unfortunately, that's the subject of our debate here.
Yeah, but I'm hoping if I keep going now for another 25 minutes, it'll actually turn out about what the BBC is going to do. But you won't let me, I know. I just think that's the debate we've got to have because it's an important debate for our country. And I go back also about how we fund dramas, shows, and stuff. Get great stuff from Netflix, no doubt about that. Get great stuff from. But actually, this is about who we are. It's our identity. The dramas, the programs we make, the country files, all that stuff. It's about who we are. That's an important debate. Therefore, how do you fund the BBC?
Okay. Well, so let's work on the principle that you all think that the license fee remains the certain, for good or for bad, the least.
I think we're talking about two different versions, though, because I'm asking the question: is it compulsory?
Right. Well, let's come on to that. But I just wanted to bring in.
If you don't have a TV,
right,
you still have to pay.
Okay. So
I think
what's your No. Do you have an answer to that question?
I think that's the fundamental question. We've got 17% of the country are not paying at the moment, and unless we make a change to that, the current trends will continue, and Mark's sort of downward spiral will go on. You leave that for another 10 years. If you don't change that, you'll see a couple of percentage points drop off that number each year, as it's done for the last 7 years. And by, as we're sort of at this stage of the next charter renewal, the figure will be down to 65%. And unless the rate's gone up quite a lot, the funding will be reduced.
Yeah.
But of course, if you try and push the rate up to try and compensate for that, you might accelerate the decline. And, as I say, look, that's one possible outcome, and that's perhaps the least controversial outcome because it pushes the problem down the road.
Yes.
But Tim's answer, I think, is, no, I want everybody to have to pay, even if you don't have a TV, because it's a public good. We think it's a good thing. The society benefits, even if you're not a day-to-day consumer, so everybody should contribute.
Yes. Okay.
But I don't know if people actually want to confront that argument and make it to the public.
Understood. I mean, Mark, I think one of the most striking slides was the divergence between number of households and households paying the license fee. And I mean, you're suggesting some ways in which that could be addressed. I mean, what's your instinct? How does the BBC or the government bridge that gap?
If you ask me what I think will happen,
Yes.
it will become a household charge with more concessions.
So if it's a household charge, you do have to pay.
But there'll be more concessions.
If you don't have a TV, you've still got to pay.
But you think that will still be called a license fee of sorts?
Well, I think it's slightly odd for it to call it a license fee from the very beginning of the BBC and through the first few decades, it was to a degree a user pays service. You only had to pay it when you bought a television. If you didn't have a television, you weren't asked to pay for the BBC. But I think that is what's being contemplated now for the first time. That even if you have no interest in watching television services of any kind, BBC or anything else, you have no TV, I think it's being contemplated that you nonetheless have to pay. And that will be the first time in 100 years of history. So it's an unprecedented level of compulsion that's being contemplated. And I think that's quite a big thing to try and sell to the public. It sounds like a new tax to me. And I'm not sure if this government is quite ready to do that. But Mark and I are economists. We can debate the economics. In the end, I think it's about the politics.
Caroline, what's the Conservative position on this?
Well, I've no idea. But I'm not sure there is one. There will be, I'm sure, but not that I'll necessarily be a part of it, because as a select committee chair, I have to try and remain neutral on all these matters.
Kemi, does Kemi Banner want to scrap the license? I mean, she's not the biggest fan of the BBC, as far as I can make out.
Yeah, as I say, I don't know. I'm not privy to that sort of information. But what I would say is like a couple of points, I guess. We do have to do something to address, so but if I think about my kids' their generation, 22 and 17, they literally never watch television. They literally never watch it. They will watch things on their tablets or on their laptops and predominantly get information from YouTube, from TikTok. And so, that's what we're dealing with. And actually, sort of just funnily enough, sitting here listening to you, I began to think, how often do I actually turn on the BBC? How often do I actually do it myself? I occasionally will watch something on iPlayer, but how often do I physically turn on the television and get the channel to, and our viewing habits are changing. And so we do have to come up with something that addresses not just for now, but for the future. We've got to future-proof it. But against the backdrop of, we cannot rely upon, especially in the world we live in, we cannot rely upon YouTube and other social media platforms to deliver things like that reliable source of news and information. We certainly can't necessarily rely on them to produce cultural input which completely reflects the areas that we were talking about this in my select committee this morning. We're toying with the idea of doing a bit of work on children's television, and because we're all very elderly, we were sort of casting our minds back to the children's TV that was on when we were kids. And how, first of all, we heard lots of regional voices. So we were talking about how we remember watching Why Don't You, and how we'd see kids in Northern Ireland, and we used to love it because they used to say film rather than film. And so we'd get that sort of cultural view. We'd have to watch things that weren't necessarily our favourite programmes, whereas these days kids can turn on the thing and then just stream endless episodes of the same thing, where our minds were open because we, to be fair, either the engine was a bit boring, but we sat through that in order to get to think of a number, or obviously in our household, how, very popular. So there's a sort of cultural thing, that we need to hold on to as well, and that actually I think, and that goes back to my my first point about how is it that you've, other than sort of, nice highbrow speeches made by politicians or senior figures in the BBC, how do we get that message across to everybody, to the young consumers that are on their tablets looking at getting their news from TikTok? How do we get the message to them that the BBC has value, not just for them, but actually to us as a nation?
That might be another route. Stopping short of household charge, you could make it a broadband household charge, because it is related to some connectivity, not just your household. So
the BBC has floated this idea as well. I think under your leadership, Tony. I think you talked about this internally.
The issue last time round was rather similar. It was about what's the license fee for, and I think it's very interesting what Mark's just made, because I think that is an interesting area to look at. I think this is one of the areas which needs to be examined in this debate and this process, which is, what is the license fee? What are you actually paying it for? Because, you may not watch television, but you use it on YouTube, or you use the BBC content in TikTok, or whatever it happens to be. Or you just happen to use the weather forecast, or on your phone, you're doing the news. So what are you paying it for, and how you therefore call it, I think is an important area of discussion and debate. I think Mark's analysis of the progressive nature of the license fee, which I really believe, I said this 2 years ago, the license fee needs to be progressive in terms of the way it's charged. I think the over 75s debate led to that conclusion as well. But as Mark says, that's really hard. That needs to be worked through. I think there's two other things as well. Mark's deprivation analysis is really interesting, and this points to what Caroline's been saying about the BBC's selling itself. We did a similar deprivation analysis somewhere around 16, 17, I can't remember. And actually the entire cadre of, I think, eight people, bar one, went back to saying, I now realise what the BBC does, and I'm really happy to pay. And the one person that couldn't was someone who said, I've got a kid to feed. I just can't afford it. So that points you back to the progressive nature of the license fee, and can you get that? The other thing which I think it came out in my town, as well, strongly, was how do people judge value? So if you're kind of an older person, I suppose like me in a way, then actually watching hours and hours of television says a good value. Actually, the perception of value from other audiences is not necessarily that. It is, I'm getting a service here which is very specific. It could be Glastonbury once a year, but actually is giving me value for money. So I think the notion of what is value for money needs carefully thinking through, and it's not the same for everybody.
Okay, the reason I mentioned broadband was because, going back to funding and purpose, general sense that a lot of things that happen on the web are not good for society. So you have to tie in, you pay your broadband fee because the BBC does things which are good for society. It may drag the BBC into doing things like social media, which I don't think they want to go anywhere near, but it'll be a consistent view of the BBC. People have broadband, there are problems with broadband, undermining UK content, international content, problems about standards, trust in news, etc. So we always pay a charge to correct that problem. That might be an intellectually consistent point to make. And if you add on some concessions, some vulnerable groups, that might work.
The other thing that I know Tim Davies speaks about a lot is whether the BBC should really be subsidising all of the things that it currently is. So, for example, the BBC World Service, as Tony said, is unbelievably valuable from not just a soft power point of view, but from an international security point of view. Because we've seen in countries where, when the BBC World Service has been cut, where they've withdrawn their services, and particularly in some really, really challenging parts of the world, like Afghanistan, where their service has been withdrawn, it's been immediately backfilled by Russian, Chinese broadcasting, which is having millions and millions and millions invested in it at a time when we're withdrawing funding for that, and at a time when USAID has been cut, and at a time when the UK aid budget is being cut. Actually, we do have to look at the power of something like that, and actually whether that's the BBC's role to explicitly be paying for that, or whether actually the government. I mean, I know the government is doing
a knockdown argument to pay that from taxation.
I completely. It's bonkers that it's
I
forced upon them.
completely agree with you, because actually to say to somebody, your license fee is to go to pay for what was effectively audiences around the world is just, I don't think it's right at all. So I think the BBC and Tim are right to be arguing for that. But simply saying we'll transfer that to license fees, all enough. I think what you're arguing, Kai, which is right, which is we should be putting more into this, because even though the sums compared with what China and Russia are putting in are tiny, are minuscule, it's astonishing the reach and the power of the World Service only having a budget of that size.
Yeah, and one of the most trusted voices in the world.
I'm sure we could do a whole session on the service.
It's enough.
So no, it's important. It's an important part of this debate, because obviously, this is an issue that is very live for the BBC at the moment. I mean, but I just want to run with the broadband suggestion that you made, Mark. I mean, obviously, when we start talking about other universal funding models, you start to approach questions around independence and the BBC and the way the money is collected. Your own committee, I appreciate it may have been another chair, looked at some of the other models in Europe, and they found that in places like Netherlands, that it actually was destabilizing their funding and eroded the broadcasters' independence. How important is it that the BBC's independence is preserved as part of any changes that may be made to its funding model? Tony, do you want to take that one?
I think the notion of some independent way of looking at what we want out of the BBC to be funded, the quantum is really important. I think the notion of the charter coming up for renewal I won 11 years, which was a long one. I mean, the threat was then 4 years or possibly even less. I think from the independence point of view, a charter forever, as Samir has been arguing, is absolutely spot on. And then you come back and say, well, if it's forever, like every other organisation is, then what are the points at which you can ask the BBC and examine what the BBC is doing and check whether it feels right or not? I think that's really important. I think board membership is important. I mean, I would go for a sort of total freedom for the board to choose a chair, and for the people who are on the board to be chosen by the board, like any other board. I doubt that'll pass muster. In which case, number 10 chooses the chair with a fair process. But then the chair ought to be allowed to choose the people on the board that they think are right to make sure that the single board, that the organisation is held to account, but also it's thinking through strategic direction. And I think both those things, I hope, get sorted in the debate.
Do you think there should be an independent body that deals with BBC funding and sets BBC funding?
I think there should be an independent body which advises, a bit like sort of pay review bodies, which says to the government, this is actually what we think. If you want the following services, this is what we think the quantum of the license fee should be, or this is the commercial target you should be setting ourselves through BBC Studios, or this is what the BBC should be doing to fund BBC World Service. Because, as Mark pointed out, the BBC is already funded in 3 different ways anyway. And I think some independence in that would be absolutely useful for people to say, well, that's what they said. The government then will turn around and say, no, we're not going to do that. Because they think,
I was going to say, isn't the truth of the matter that the government likes...
It's harder, yes, but it's harder to do that when you've got people who are thinking through the arguments and thinking through... here's one. The graphics which Mark showed about the way the license fee has basically fallen in real terms by 30% over 20 years of that sort of order, has not kept up with CPI, RPI. It's been just sat on, and Tim's having to deal with 2 years of flat license fee with all the inflation going on around COVID. It's just not right for that organisation. The BBC has been in retreat for 20 years because of the way the licence fee has been treated. Now, to bring in an independent body that can look at that and say, well, we think this is what it needs, government then will deploy, and we can't afford that, and da-da-da-da, or they'll accept it. But the public can see the debate about the funding of this really important organisation. And at the moment, it is opaque. And that funding settlement is done behind closed doors. That's not the way. If you want an accountable organisation, that's not the way to run it.
Mike, you had some thoughts.
Well, just that I think Tony's proposal works in the end, because I think that if we're talking about a license fee, potentially one that is compulsory, it is basically like a tax. And I don't think you can totally detach that from the democratic process. I don't think you can have completely independent bodies deciding on how people should be taxed and at what level. I think, we vote politicians in and
to do that.
and we get that. But yes, I mean, like we do with paid bodies and the rest, somebody could be making a recommendation, thought through, this is the logic. But ultimately, I think it has to come back to politicians in the end, because that's who sets tax policy.
Yeah.
They don't really do taxation without representation. I think the Americans got a set about.
And are we completely ruling out other alternatives? I mean, you mentioned advertising, subscription. Does anyone think that these things are plausible for the BBC? I know you sort of think, well, obviously it is a subscription, but I think,
yeah, I think it is. And I think if Tim doesn't get his way, it becomes increasingly apparent that that's true.
Yeah. Caroline, what's your position on those two things specifically?
To be honest with you, I haven't really seen what they would look like, because they as much as everyone says we're starting with a blank piece of paper, we're very open-minded, then advertising and subscription almost then immediately gets taken off the table. So you never really get a chance to sort of look under the bonnet and see how that would work. I mean, I can understand why they're dismissed, but because on the face of it, neither of them necessarily look like a good fit for the BBC. But equally, we never really get to see the working. So,
I mean, that's right. I tend to think they should look at that. I
wouldn't your old employer Sky be quite against both subscription and an advertising model for the BBC?
Yes.
No.
Well, no, I don't run the strategy department anymore. But
how come these guys quite forward?
Well, I tell you, the evidence we got from the select committee was a big no, thank you, from commercial broadcasters. And subscription likewise. Don't come into our
Okay. A counterpoint to that, however, if you've got a growing number of people who are IP only and so are not paying the license fee, if they one day wake up and think, I'd like to subscribe to Sky because I'd like Sky Sports, today there's a barrier there to that. Because the moment they connect to a broadcast platform, the first thing they have to do is pay the license fee. So there's a £175 barrier before somebody can become a Sky subscriber. Similarly, if somebody is on the outside, IP only, and thinks, God, there's a great new show on ITV, I'd really like to watch that. But the first thing I'd have to do before I can do that is pay the license fee. So there's a £175 barrier there. And I don't think people have really thought about that enough. So,
but equally,
I'm not running those departments, but
equally, I mean, people do that already with streaming services, don't they? I mean, I'm guilty of subscribing to streaming services just because there's one particular show that I want to see. And then I forget.
But you want to watch that, so you pay for that. I'm talking about a scenario where in order to watch that, you first have to pay for this and then you have to pay for that.
Yeah.
Which is unusual.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the last 10 years, 15 years, globally across television shows that by far and away the most efficient and effective business model for funding investment in television is a combination of pay and advertising. I think players are increasingly converging on that. And I'm slightly unsure why in the end we would deny that combination to the BBC.
Okay, fascinating.
I would just say one thing on that, which is I think the idea of universality needs rebooting. I don't think people quite understand what universality means, but I think people are up for it. And it actually means, it's a bit like the British Museum. We don't charge to go into the British Museum, or we don't charge to go to the Natural History Museum. These are things, and the BBC is one of those assets which is there for everybody to use as much as they want. And, you want to have a news service which is free to people to use. The fact it's the most used news service in the UK. It's the fifth most, number 5 in a series of brands that people recognise among young people too. All this says there's a huge amount there to build on the notion of the stuff which is there to bring us together and to be something which is part of what we all share. And I go back to that slide Mark had of the polarized nature on the one side and me on the other, and this sense that there are things which are there to be a common purpose is really, and a social good is a really important. Not to say that actually what I think Sky's done with subscription and others do in advertising isn't important and brilliant, but that part of the equation, it's part of what makes the public service broadcasting, that's another thing which actually needs rethinking in terms of how people can communicate that. But that fact we have a BBC, a Channel 4, an ITV doing things, a Channel 5, is part of that. And by the way, Sky Arts, Sky News is part of an ecology of this country, which really works well. And I think whatever we do over the next couple of years for Charter, look at the BBC as part of that ecology and make sure that that ecology grows and meets the challenges of the future. Because I think it's very precious.
There has to be made, and I don't see it being made.
No, I agree with you. I think the argument should be made. It's very precious. And I tell you, I had a fascinating time as president of the EBU, and not just the song contest, but all the other stuff that goes with that. Although that was quite interesting. And the thing, very interesting actually, but we're not here to talk about the thing which, all of you will know, you leave this country, you go abroad and people say, we want a BBC and we want public service, but we want the ecology you've got with Channel 4, Channel 5, all that sort of stuff. People want it. You come back to Heathrow and read the front of the Mail. It's very different, and I think we've got to make the argument for what we know is good and special in this country, and it's very special, and that ecology is really important.
Okay, I'm going to open up to questions shortly, so get your thinking caps on. Mark, one of the really interesting things I thought in your slides was that a sort of underpriced discussion is around a hybrid model, and what does that look like potentially for the BBC?
We already have it.
Yeah.
There was UK TV, and
of course,
so BBC Studio channels are only available on paid platforms.
But you're saying that that's a very successful way forward potentially.
Well, it's how much you could increase that.
Yeah.
What the residual would look like. But if there's pressure on the level of a license fee, especially if it becomes a household charge, one way to deal with that is a concession to people who can't afford it. Another way is to make some people pay more, but not just because they're more wealthy, but because they're using more of it. So rather than making it all subscription, you have a top-up payment. You used to have to pay for a book for the BBC programme. People would have, given that for free. The problem is that convergence of media means that the book is now online, and so it becomes an online thing, and it's there for free. And the BBC in the past did think about getting people to pay for the iPlayer. It was considered. There was also a digital license fee, which would be people migrated to digital. So there has in the past been a kind of two-part payment thinking. And of course, the BBC initially benefited from the black and white license versus the colour license, which meant its income grew enormously in the 70s and 80s, which came crash into an end at the end of the 80s because colour licenses weren't growing anymore. So there's always been a kind of two-part payment thing in the background, and it's not really been looked at. There's always the argument, as we said, if you have this commercial income, the license fee or the public fund will get smaller and smaller. And people always think, well, that means all the worthy program will be license fee and all the good dramas and comedy you have to pay for. That's not the way it will work out. It won't be by genre, it will be by purpose. So there's things for everybody and there's things for me, and there's a difference. So there's a way, but it's difficult. And because it's difficult, people then go, it's either all subscription advertising or it's all public funding. So that's never been looked at, as well as subscription. The numbers never been shown to people. That's never been looked at seriously.
Has anyone ever looked at whether the BBC are suitably capitalising on some of the assets that they do have? Like, sort of, for example, if I go overseas and I want to go onto my BBC iPlayer, I can't. Are there?
It does come up in discussion, of course, and the NAO actually produced reports on that as well in terms of use of commercial contribution. But it's always part of the side argument.
Yeah,
they should earn a bit more money in order to earn some profit in order to put into the license fee. It's never seen as part of the BBC service. Something that's its only role is to contribute cash.
Yeah,
and it would have that role, but it's never seen as part of what the BBC provides, because there's a danger you get a two-tier public service, right? And that's what stops it happening.
Okay, just before I open up to questions, I mean, the government put out a sector paper for the creative industries yesterday. One of the really interesting elements of that was they have asked the Competition and Markets Authority and Ofcom to assess whether there could be greater collaboration and indeed consolidation between public service broadcasters. And that work is going to happen over the coming months. The idea that constantly gets surfaced when that discussion comes up is, should the BBC buy Channel 4 or should BBC Studios buy Channel 4? Tony, what do you think? Should the BBC be able to buy Channel 4?
I think
Would that be healthy?
I think thinking about BBC and Channel 4 together and their joint strengths is a good idea. Maybe that's in distribution. Maybe that's in terms of where they invest, in terms of programming. But that idea is worth looking at. The notion that the BBC should scoop up Channel 4 and buy it for whatever, I'm not so sure about that. But you'd be mad not to have conversations between the BBC and Channel 4 about how they can mutually support each other. And
do you think those conversations are going on at the moment? Do you hear whispers of those kinds of?
I don't know what goes on. I mean,
I'm sure you do. I'm
busy enjoying myself at the Natural History Museum. Do come, fantastic David Attenborough exhibition, please. But no, I mean, look, I would imagine conversations would go on about that because I think it would be a good thing to do. And it goes back to my point about the ecology and the strengths this country has. Channel 4 is definitely one of them, and the BBC is another one. So,
Do you think that calibration is do or die in the face of the competition from the likes of Netflix and YouTube?
I think it's an incentive to work more closely. I've always thought that if you looked at the public interventions in broadcasting, the BBC funded by the licence fee, Channel 4 funded on a not-for-profit model by advertising, the audiences you're reaching and the spirit you have in each is actually rather distinctive and rather important. And I think looking at them both as being precious assets, I think is right. And making sure that, I go back. I love Netflix. Reed Hastings is a complete bloody genius starting that off and bring it in. But Channel 4 and BBC are commissioning and doing things which Netflix will simply not do because they've got an international audience. And actually, if you look at the hours that the BBC commissions and Channel 4 commissions versus the hours of UK material that Netflix, Prime and so on commission, then it's a no-brainer that you need to have national broadcasters commissioning UK content, commissioning stories about ourselves that tell our lives. So if you can do that more effectively with Channel 4, BBC, great. But that's the question we should be fundamentally facing.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes for questions and there are lots of hands. Balu, let's go to you. We have a mic, yes.
Hello, thank you. That's a really interesting conversation. Just talking about the purpose of the BBC, I think what's really interesting is that from where I work at ITN, there's lots of conversations about trust in the media and conversations about paternalistic kind of models and people's engagement with them. And my question to the panel is whether the BBC can learn from platforms like YouTube in the sense that they have arguments about investing in the creator economy. So obviously the BBC will talk about investing in indies, but is it time for the purpose of the BBC to be demonstrated through learnings around kind of how those new platforms are operating?
Caroline, you're nodding. Do you want to take that one?
Yeah, no, I think that I think the BBC has. I mean, all our sort of terrestrial broadcasters, if you like, have to look at how they can learn from the huge growth of YouTube. I know that Channel 4, for example, have done quite a lot of crossover by getting their work onto their output onto YouTube, and then there's a bit of sort of cross-fertilization backwards and forwards. But I think we have to address the modern world as it is, not the modern world as maybe some people want it to be, and that means learning from everyone that's growing their market, doing things in a different and more intuitive way that sort of lends itself to the modern world. Yes.
Would anyone like to come in, or we'll go to another question if that's okay? Just down the front here, please. If you could just say your name, that'd be fantastic.
Hi, Tansy, RTS member. I'm just intrigued by the value for money question, because it's interesting here you're talking about Sky, and also sort of if you don't subscribe to BBC, if you haven't got the BBC, then you can watch other things. A load of them are made with BBC Skills, BBC Trade Aid, BBC Talent, BBC Origin. You are getting the value sort of further down the line. And the value it does in soft power and the value it does in international sales and creative industries, that's quite quantifiable. So if you look at production companies, you're looking at Lockerbie showed on Prime, half of world productions are ex-BBC, trained by Ridley Scott, former BBC Manchester. It's quite quantifiable. So why is the value for money message not getting across? What's the structural cultural blocker that nobody seems to understand that value is there? And mutualization as an option, you'd be able to quite quickly show how much value it's generating. So why is that discussion not taking place? What's the cultural institutional block of that happening?
Well, I think number one, I'm not too sure mutualization would help, to be frank. I think mutualization, you first of all start by thinking, mutualization, what a good idea. That feels nice. I have my nationwide account. It all feels rather good. And then you actually start thinking about, and there are other building societies available, by the way. And then you start thinking, hang on, what does that mean? Is it a workable organization? Could you actually make decisions in this organization? I think is quite hard. So I think so I'm not too sure that's the answer to your question, which is how do we get these debates and value for the BBC out there? I tell you, it's quite hard getting these. I mean, I don't, envy the current BBC team. It's quite hard getting these discussions and debates out there for people to take part in. But I do think your point you're making, which is a creative economy point in a way, which is the BBC is a trainer, gives people their first leg up, as it were, into the industry, and does that as Channel 4 does around the UK, is really important. And you're right, that is quantifiable. I mean, it's simply, you can see the impact, for example, of Doctor Who to the Cardiff area. That's quantifiable. So you're right. So more of that out there. I'm completely with you. I think we should ask for that and make sure we get it. Yeah.
Anyone want to come in on that point? I think a lot of it is quantifiable. There are, of course, things that operate in the other direction as well that you'd have to take account of. But I think it's mainly an inside baseball conversation, really. I think the man or woman on the Clapham bus is not going to engage with that sort of complexity. I think their value for money equation is sort of, as Mark said, it's what am I being asked to pay? What am I getting? And yeah, there may be other theoretical arguments out there, but I think realistically, they're not going to engage with them.
Yeah.
Ryan?
I think it's a really good question, and it's something we sort of started discussing it a little bit. My committee did our report into film and high-end TV a couple of months ago, which the government's just about to respond to this week, I think. And one of the things we recommended was a streamer levy to go back into British film and high-end TV production. And the reason that we recommended it was, it's quite a bold suggestion. Not everybody's loving it. I'm not going to lie.
They've ruled it out, haven't they, the government?
Yeah,
eventually.
The government will, yeah. But, the reason we put it in there is because we wanted to start the conversation. Because actually, if you think about the people that we took evidence from, one of the first people that gave evidence for that select committee was James Hawes, who's just directed, what's that movie called?
Slow Horses?
He directed Slow Horses, but also the Rami Malek movie that's just come out a few weeks ago. Yeah, sorry, elderly brain. He started life at the BBC. He started life on That's Life, and his skills. We talk about our world-class British film and high-end TV sector, and the reason that so many global companies invest in the UK. Yes, it's tax incentives, but it's skills. It's that amazing skills base that we have here. And so much of that started in the BBC. And that's why we can't lose sight of it. We've got to find a way of making sure we get that message across. And that's why we included that as one of our recommendations in the select committee, because it was just a way of sort of trying to perpetuate that conversation. And a lot of people didn't like it, but my God, they were talking about it.
Okay, one more. You're standing up, sir. So, yeah.
My question is whether this government is in danger of framing the debate about the future of the BBC as badly as its predecessor. It's worth remembering the tiny sums of money involved in terms of the 5% on defence. How much does licence fee cost? Less than 4 billion. Well, we may hear the BBC's funding traduced on a daily basis by newspapers, but it's tiny. The second thing to be borne in mind is that this last government, Tony said it, but I think he slightly understated it, reduced the BBC's real terms income by going on 40%. And at the same time encouraged an atmosphere of disinformation. You can go to YouTube now and look up licence fee, and you'll hear a motley voiceover saying, "Are they coming for your granny now?" That was done over and over at the decades. It has an influence. So the BBC, in terms of responses to research, a lot of what's fed back at you about the BBC comes from disinformation. And last, remember, the last staging of the Conservative government's down on the BBC was administered by Nadine Dorries, a woman who did not understand the funding model of Channel 4. Just think about that. Is there a danger that this government, which isn't, you would think, hostile to the BBC, is not going to conduct this debate properly?
Okay, Tony, it's, from your answer so far, it sounds like you...
Well, there's a lot to agree with.
The conversation is not happening in the right way.
So the positive thing is that I think now, in the next so many months, year and a half, whatever, this government has the chance to settle the BBC and its future for a generation, and likewise Channel 4. And I think that sort of strategic, big thinking needs to be done, and I really hope they run with that. I think we're at a really important point in the BBC's history, and a whole lot could be sorted against other governments that might come in the future. They've got the chance to do something really big, and I hope they do it.
Okay, that sounds like a good note to end on. So thank you, Mike Darcey, Tony Hall, Caroline Dinenage, and Mark Oliver.